Hey guys, tonight, let's turn back the clock. Not just a few centuries, but tens of thousands of years. Back to a time when the greatest technology was a sharpened stick, and the most important decision of the day was whether the fire would last through the night. We're going to explore the surprisingly busy, occasionally ridiculous, and deeply human life of our earliest ancestors. What did cavemen actually do all day? It turns out it wasn't all grunting and dramatic fire discoveries. It was life, complicated, messy, and full of small moments that somehow feel remarkably familiar, even across the vast expanse of time. Picture this somewhere in what is now France, 40,000 years ago. Someone is lying awake in a cave, staring at shadows dancing on the rock ceiling, worrying about tomorrow's weather. Someone else is carefully mending a tear in their leather clothing by the dim glow of embers. A child is asking their grandmother, for the 100th time, to tell the story about the Great Hunt. These are the moments we rarely think about when we imagine the past, but they're the moments that made us human. So before we begin our journey into the deep past, find your most comfortable spot. Maybe dim the lights a little lower tonight. Let the world outside fade away. And listen. If you close your eyes, you might hear the faint sound of a fire crackling, a sound that has comforted humans for millennia. Let's ease into tonight's story together, as countless generations have done before us, gathered around the warm glow of flame, sharing the day's experiences as darkness settles in. As always, if you enjoy these quiet journeys, we take together through the corridors of time. A gentle tap on the like button is always appreciated, but only if you feel it. There's no pressure here, just an invitation to be part of our little community of nighttime wanderers and history dreamers. And in the comments, I'd love to know, what's one modern convenience you think you'd miss the most in the Stone Age for me? It might just be a soft pillow. The thought of resting my head on a bundle of animal fur every night makes me appreciate the simple luxury of memory foam in ways I never considered before. Maybe for you, it's running water, or electric lights, or simply the certainty that your morning coffee will be waiting for you. These small comforts that we barely notice might have seemed like pure magic to our ancestors. But here's what's beautiful about tonight's exploration. We're not just looking back at how different life was. We're discovering how remarkably similar we've always been. The same needs, the same hopes, the same desire for warmth and safety and connection, the same tendency to worry about things beyond our control, and the same capacity to find joy in unexpected moments. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to meet your ancestors not as primitive beings from a forgotten world, but as people. People who loved and worried and laughed and dreamed. People who faced each day with the same fundamental human spirit that beats in your chest right now. Their world was harder, stranger, and more uncertain than ours. But their hearts were exactly the same. Tonight, we begin with a single day in their lives. You don't wake up to an alarm. You wake up to the chill seeping through your animal hide blanket, or perhaps the persistent cough of someone sleeping a little too close. The ground beneath you is unforgiving stone, softened only by layers of dried grass and fur that never quite manage to cushion the hard reality of earth. Your body aches in places you forgot could ache, each joint a small protest against another night spent on nature's least comfortable mattress. The air is thick with the smell of old smoke, unwashed bodies, and the musky scent of animal hides that have seen better days, months, maybe years, better days. But these smells aren't unpleasant anymore. Not really. They're the smell of home, of safety, of your people. It's the smell of survival wrapped in leather and warmed by shared breath. Around you, the cave is beginning to stir with the soft sounds of a community waking up. Someone shifts nearby, their hide blanket rustling like autumn leaves. A child whimpers softly before settling back into sleep. An elder clears their throat with a gravelly sound that echoes off the stone walls. These are the gentle sounds of morning in a world without clocks, without schedules, without any certainty except the slow rhythm of day and night. But there's something else in the air this morning, something that makes your stomach tighten even before you're fully awake. It's too quiet. Missing is the soft crackling that should be the soundtrack to every morning. The gentle whisper of flames consuming wood, the occasional pop of sap meeting fire. The silence where that sound should be is deafening. The first conscious thought isn't about breakfast. It's about the fire. Is it still glowing? You lift your head, blinking away the haze of sleep, and peer toward the center of the cave where the fire pit sits like the heart of your small world. There should be the warm orange glow of coals, the dancing shadows on the cave walls that have become as familiar as faces. Instead, there's just gray, cold, lifeless gray, where warmth should live. Your heart sinks. The fire has died. In our modern world, we wake up worried about deadlines, about traffic, about whether we remembered to set the coffee maker. But here, 40,000 years ago, the first worry of the day could mean the difference between life and death. Fire isn't just comfort, it's survival. It's warmth when the night air could freeze the life from your bones. It's protection from the things that hunt in the darkness. It's the difference between raw meat that might make you sick and cooked food that will keep you strong. But perhaps most importantly, fire is community. It's the invisible thread that binds your small group together, the focal point around which life revolves. When the fire dies, a little bit of that security dies with it. You can almost feel the collective anxiety ripple through the cave as others begin to wake and notice the same cold absence you've discovered. Someone will have to rebuild it. Someone will have to take 2 pieces of dry wood and rub them together until their hands are raw and their arms ache. Until the tiny wisps of smoke finally, hopefully, become something more. It's a process that can take an hour on a good day, much longer if the wood is damp, or if your technique isn't perfect. And there's always the chance, the terrible possibility, that it won't work at all. Forgetting to charge your phone is annoying. You might miss a few messages, feel disconnected from the world for a while. But forgetting to feed the fire, that's a group crisis. That's 20 people waking up to a day that just became infinitely more difficult, more uncertain, more dangerous. That's the difference between a warm breakfast and no breakfast at all, between safety and vulnerability, between comfort and the raw edge of survival. You can already see the accusing glances that will be exchanged. Whose job was it to tend the fire through the night, who fell asleep when they should have been awake, feeding small sticks to the flames? It's not malicious, this blame. It's the sharp edge of fear dressed up as frustration. Because in a world where so much is beyond your control, the fire is one of the few things that shouldn't be. But even as your mind races through the implications, even as you calculate the work ahead and the risks that come with it, there's something else happening. The person next to you is already sitting up, their movements purposeful and calm. Across the cave, an elder is quietly gathering the materials needed for fire making. This isn't the first time the fire has died, and it won't be the last. Your people know what to do. And so, for now, there's an odd moment of peace in the crisis. The fire is dead. Yes, the day will be harder because of it. But the world outside the cave entrance is still a dark, misty gray, and dawn is still some time away. You have a few moments of relative peace before the day's survival truly begins. A few quiet heartbeats to appreciate the warmth of the person sleeping beside you, and the simple miracle that you've made it through another night. Personal hygiene existed, just not in a way that would get you a second date today. As the fire making begins, and the cave slowly fills with the blessed warmth of rekindled flames, your thoughts turn to the small rituals of morning preparation. In our world, this might mean a hot shower, toothpaste, deodorant, and the careful selection of clean clothes. In yours, 40,000 years ago, it's a much more creative process. The concept of daily bathing simply doesn't exist. Water is precious, often scarce, and always cold. When you do bathe, it's a seasonal affair, dictated by opportunity rather than preference. Perhaps you found a stream that hasn't frozen solid, or maybe the spring rains have filled a natural basin in the rocks near your cave. Either way, bathing in a freezing stream wasn't a spa day. It was a test of will, a brief and shocking reminder that comfort is a luxury your world simply doesn't offer. The water hits your skin like 1,000 tiny needles, so cold it actually burns. You work quickly, scrubbing away layers of dirt and sweat with handfuls of coarse sand or smooth river stones. There's no lingering, no relaxation, just the desperate efficiency of someone who knows that staying too long in this icy water could be dangerous. Your breath comes in sharp, visible puffs as you rinse, and every instinct screams at you to get out, get dry, get warm. But here's where ingenuity meets necessity. Your ancestors discovered that animal fat, the rendered grease from a mammoth or elk, makes an excellent cleanser. Rubbed into the skin, it lifts away grime and old oils, while leaving behind a protective layer that helps trap body heat. It's soap and moisturizer and insulation all in one, a multitasking miracle born from the simple reality that everything in your world must serve multiple purposes. The fat has its own distinctive smell, musky and rich, but it's not unpleasant when you're accustomed to it. More importantly, it keeps your skin from cracking in the dry, cold air, and it provides a barrier against the constant wind that seems to find every gap in your clothing. You work it into your arms, your face, your hands, feeling the immediate relief as your skin drinks in this primitive but effective protection. Dental care, meanwhile, requires its own kind of creativity. There are no bristles, no mint-flavored paste, just the simple tools that nature provides. A thin, fibrous stick serves as your toothbrush, its frayed end working between your teeth to remove the remnants of yesterday's meal. Sometimes you use a small, sharp bone to pick at stubborn bits of food, careful not to damage the gums that have no antibiotics to heal them if they become infected. Interestingly, your teeth are actually in better condition than they'll be for most of human history after this. With no sugar in your diet, no processed foods to stick between your molars, cavities are virtually unknown. But your teeth face a different challenge: the constant presence of sand and grit in your food. Every meal includes tiny particles of stone from grinding grain, bits of ash from cooking over fire, microscopic fragments that slowly, steadily wear down your enamel. Your teeth don't rot, they sand away, gradually becoming shorter and flatter as the years pass. Your wardrobe, such as it is, presents its own unique challenges. The animal hide clothing you wear is incredibly durable, designed to last for months or even years. But washing it is nearly impossible. The leather would become stiff and unusable if soaked repeatedly. So instead, you rely on airing it out, scraping away the worst of the accumulated dirt, and simply accepting that fashion is less about appearance and more about function. The result is a cave that carries its own distinctive bouquet. It's a mixture of wood smoke, cured leather, human sweat, animal fat, and the earthy smell of people who spend their lives very close to the ground. It sounds overwhelming, but like everything else in this world, you adapt. The smell becomes background, as unremarkable as the sound of breathing or the feeling of your own heartbeat. Everyone smelled pretty much the same, which was a form of social camouflage. In a world without artificial scents, without perfumes or deodorants, the natural human smell was simply part of the landscape. You only stood out if you did something extreme, like rolling in a dead animal to mask your scent for a hunt. And yes, this actually happened. When tracking large game, hunters would sometimes cover themselves with the scent of carrion or animal dung. Anything to disguise their human smell from the sensitive noses of their prey. It was remarkably effective at fooling elk and bison. It was probably less effective at making you popular back at the cave. The successful hunter might return with meat for the whole group, but they definitely ate dinner downwind from everyone else. But even this rather pungent reality had its gentle rhythms. By morning, after a night spent around the fire, even the most aromatic hunter would smell more like smoke than like their hunting disguise. The fire was a great equalizer, wrapping everyone in the same comfortable scent of burning wood and warm stone, creating an olfactory unity that bound the group together as surely as any shared meal or common language. There was no concept of a most important meal of the day. There was only a meal, if you're lucky. As the morning light gradually filters through the cave entrance, painting the stone walls in soft shades of gray and gold, your stomach begins its familiar morning conversation. It's not the gentle rumble of modern hunger, the kind that knows relief is just a kitchen away. This is deeper, more insistent, the kind of hunger that understands uncertainty as a constant companion. You begin the morning ritual that will determine whether this day starts with satisfaction or continues with the gnawing emptiness that makes every other task more difficult. First, you check the food cache, those carefully hidden corners of the cave where yesterday's leftovers might be waiting like small treasures. Sometimes you're lucky. Perhaps there's a strip of dried meat hanging from a smoke-blackened ledge, tough as leather, but rich with concentrated nutrition. Or maybe a handful of nuts, gathered weeks ago during the brief abundance of autumn, now precious as jewels in the lean time of early spring. These discoveries feel like small miracles, unexpected gifts that transform the entire texture of your morning. But more often, the cache is empty or holds only scraps too small to satisfy the growing demand from your belly. This means your breakfast will require work, patience, and a certain willingness to expand your definition of delicious. You venture out into the cool morning air, your breath forming small clouds that dissipate quickly in the gentle breeze. The world is waking up around you, filled with the soft sounds of birds beginning their day and the distant rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. This is your grocery store, vast and unpredictable, where the shelves are roots hidden beneath the earth and the produce section consists of whatever berries have managed to ripen, despite the constant threat of being eaten by someone else. Digging for roots is meditative work. You use a pointed stick to probe the earth, feeling for the slight give that indicates a tuber hiding below. When you find one, you excavate it carefully, brushing away the dirt to reveal something that might be sweet, might be bitter, might be exactly what your body needs, or might be something that requires careful preparation to avoid making you sick. It's a gamble every time, but one informed by generations of accumulated knowledge about which plants sustain and which ones harm. The berries, when you can find them, are easier to identify but harder to obtain. They tend to grow in places that other creatures also know about, and you're not always the first to arrive at the breakfast table. What remains might be enough for a few sweet mouthfuls, bursts of flavor that remind you why the effort is worthwhile. But perhaps the most reliable breakfast protein comes from sources that would make a modern person pause. Insects are everywhere, and they're wonderfully predictable. A handful of termites or grubs might not be bacon and eggs, but they didn't run away, and they provided the energy needed to find something that did. The first time you try them, the texture is startling. Termites have a slight crunch, followed by a surprisingly nutty flavor that's not entirely unpleasant. Grubs are softer, almost creamy, with a richness that speaks to their high fat content. You learn to pick them up confidently, to chew them thoroughly, to appreciate the small burst of protein they represent. The sound they make when you bite down is subtle but distinct, a tiny snapping that becomes as familiar as any other breakfast sound. Water presents its own morning challenge. You drink from streams when you can find them, from puddles when you must, from any source that appears relatively clean and doesn't smell of death or decay. Your gut was either a fortress or a constant battlefield, strengthened by constant exposure to whatever bacteria and parasites shared your water sources, or perpetually struggling against them. There was no middle ground, no filter, no purification tablets, just hope, experience, and the robust digestive system that evolution slowly builds in those who have no choice but to drink whatever water they can find. Some mornings, though, bring unexpected fortune. You might discover what amounts to winning the prehistoric lottery, a piece of dried meat forgotten in a crevice, protected from scavengers and preserved by smoke and air. These moments feel like pure magic, like the universe conspiring to make your day a little easier. The meat is dark and hard, requiring patient chewing to soften, but it's dense with nutrients and flavor accumulated through careful preparation. As you work it between your teeth, it gradually releases its richness. Salt and smoke and the essence of whatever animal gave its life to sustain yours. It's enough protein to fuel a morning of serious work, enough satisfaction to quiet the constant whisper of hunger that serves as the background music to so much of your life. These discoveries are rare enough to be memorable, significant enough to share. When you return to the cave with unexpected bounty, it lifts the mood of the entire group. Hunger is a shared experience, and relief from hunger becomes a shared celebration, however quiet and brief it might be. As the morning mist begins to lift from the valley below, your community divides itself according to an ancient rhythm, a pattern of survival that has sustained human life for countless generations. Some will venture far in pursuit of glory and great risk. Others will work closer to home, their efforts quiet but no less vital. Both paths require courage, skill, and an intimate understanding of a world that offers no second chances for mistakes. The hunting party forms with the deliberate care of a military operation. This isn't a sport. It was a high-stakes group project where failure meant hunger, and a misstep meant you became the meal. The men gather their spears, checking each point for sharpness, each shaft for straightness. A bent spear or a loose spearhead could mean the difference between bringing down a mammoth and being trampled beneath its massive feet. The mammoth tracks they discovered yesterday are still fresh, pressed deep into the muddy earth near the river crossing. The enormous footprints tell a story a small herd, perhaps a female with young, moving slowly toward the salt licks in the northern valley. It's an opportunity, but one wrapped in deadly complexity. They move out in formation, spreading wide to avoid presenting a single target, communicating through hand signals that have been refined over generations. The air crackles with tension and anticipation. Every sense is heightened, every movement deliberate. This is the edge of survival, where human intelligence must triumph over raw power and natural weapons that could end a life in an instant. When they finally locate the herd, the real choreography begins. The hunt requires perfect timing, absolute trust in your companions, and the willingness to risk everything for the chance of feeding your entire community for weeks. They circle wide, using the wind and terrain to mask their approach. Someone positions themselves near the escape route. Others prepare to drive the animals toward a natural trap, a narrow ravine where the massive creature's size becomes a disadvantage. The moment of attack arrives with explosive suddenness. Shouts pierce the morning air as the hunters reveal themselves, their voices combining into a war cry designed to confuse and panic their prey. Spears fly through the air with deadly whispers, their bone and flint points seeking the vulnerable spots between ribs, behind shoulders, anywhere that might penetrate deep enough to matter. The mammoth's response is earth-shaking. Its trumpet of rage and fear echoes off the valley walls, a sound so primal and powerful it seems to vibrate in your bones. The ground trembles under its massive feet as it charges, tusks lowered, trunk swinging like a weapon. The hunters scatter and regroup, shouting instructions to each other over the chaos, trying to coordinate their attack while avoiding the crushing weight of their prey's desperation. One hunter stumbles, his foot catching in loose rock. For a terrifying moment, he's exposed, vulnerable, the mammoth bearing down on him with unstoppable momentum. A spear thrown by his brother finds its mark in the creature's flank, not enough to kill, but sufficient to turn its attention, to buy precious seconds for escape. This is brotherhood forged in the crucible of life and death, tested in moments when hesitation means the loss of someone irreplaceable. While the drama of the hunt unfolds in the distance, a different kind of crucial work takes place in the meadows and forests closer to home. The gathering party moves through the landscape with quiet efficiency, their eyes trained to spot opportunity in places where the untrained would see only wilderness. Hunting provided the glory, but gathering provided dinner most nights. The women, children, and elders who make up this group carry with them a library of knowledge that rivals any modern encyclopedia. They know which roots are sweet in spring and bitter in fall, which berries ripen first after rain, which bark can soothe a fever, and which sap can poison a wound. An elderly woman stops beside a cluster of plants that look identical to the untrained eye. But she sees subtle differences in leaf shape, in the pattern of veins, in the way the morning dew collects on the surface. One variety will provide nutrition. Its nearly identical cousin will cause convulsions and death. This knowledge, passed down through generations of careful observation and sometimes tragic trial and error, represents the true foundation of survival. A child learns by watching, by listening to stories that embed crucial information in memorable narratives. See how this leaf has the tiny teeth along its edge. Remember the story of the woman who ignored those teeth and fed her family the smooth leaves instead. The whole family slept forever. It's education through folklore, survival instruction wrapped in tales that stick in memory better than any formal lesson could. The work itself is meditative, almost hypnotic. Hands move through familiar motions, digging, picking, sorting, testing. The basket gradually fills with a diverse harvest tubers that will provide starch, leaves that will add essential vitamins, seeds that will offer protein and fat. It's less dramatic than the hunt, but more reliable, more predictable, and absolutely essential. They work in comfortable, near silence. The only sounds the soft whisper of hands through grass, the gentle thud of digging sticks in earth, the occasional murmur of consultation when someone discovers something unusual. This is the quiet backbone of survival, the steady work that ensures the community continues even when the hunters return empty-handed. As the day advances toward afternoon, both groups begin their journey home. The hunters return with stories of courage and near misses, their voices animated as they recount each moment of the morning's drama. Sometimes they return with meat, more often with experience and the hard-won knowledge of where not to look tomorrow. The gatherers return with food, their baskets heavy with the patient accumulation of small discoveries. Their stories are quieter, but no less important where the best tubers can be found. Which grove is producing the sweetest nuts? What signs suggest a particular meadow will bloom early this year? The hunters returned with stories. The gatherers returned with food. Both were essential for the fragile tapestry of survival. Two threads woven together to create something stronger than either could achieve alone. Without the hunt, there would be no protein for strength, no fat for warmth. Without the gathering, there would be no consistent nutrition, no plant medicines, no hedge against the days when the hunt fails. Together, they represent humanity's first and most enduring strategy for survival cooperation, specialization, and the deep understanding that every role, however different, contributes something irreplaceable to the whole. As darkness reclaimed the land, the group gathered once more around the only star they truly controlled, the fire. The day's work was done, the food distributed, the tools cleaned and stored. Now came the time that perhaps mattered most of all. Though it produced nothing tangible and accomplished nothing that could be measured in terms of immediate survival. The circle forms naturally, bodies finding their familiar positions around the dancing flames. Children nestle between adults, their eyes bright with anticipation. The elders settle into comfortable positions, their weathered faces soft in the firelight. This is the hour of stories, the time when the day's experiences transform into something larger, more enduring, more meaningful than simple survival. The storyteller tonight is an older woman whose voice carries the weight of countless tellings. She begins with the events of today's hunt, but under her skilled narration, the simple facts become something more. The mammoth grows larger, more dangerous. The hunters become more clever, more brave. The moments of fear stretch and intensify, while the eventual success glows with heroic triumph. These were the original podcasts, complete with sound effects and dramatic pauses. Her voice drops to a whisper when describing the approach to the mammoth, forcing everyone to lean in closer. It rises to a shout when the attack begins, making the children jump and laugh nervously. She uses her hands to illustrate the size of the tusks, the arc of the spears, the desperate scramble for safety. Every gesture is calculated to grip attention, to make the story live in ways that mere words never could. But the tales aren't just entertainment. Woven into the drama are lessons about tracking, about animal behavior, about which tactics work and which lead to disaster. The stories of past hunts carry forward the accumulated wisdom of generations, each telling refined and improved, polished into perfect vessels for crucial knowledge. A child listening tonight will remember these stories when they face their own mammoth years from now. As the evening deepens, someone takes a burning stick from the fire and ventures into the deeper recesses of the cave. Others follow, and you find yourself part of a small procession moving through passages lit only by the flickering torch. The walls here are different, covered with paintings that seem to come alive in the dancing light. There are animals everywhere, horses with flowing manes, bison with massive shoulders, deer caught in mid-leap. Handprints spread across the stone like signatures, each one a declaration of presence, of existence, of "I was here." The paintings seem to move in the firelight, the animals appearing to breathe, to run, to live again on the cold stone walls. Why did they do it? Maybe it was magic, a way to ensure successful hunts by capturing the spirits of the animals. Maybe it was a record, humanity's first attempt to document their world and their place in it. Or maybe, just maybe, after a long day of not dying, someone needed to create something beautiful, something that served no purpose beyond the simple joy of making art. You stand in that painted chamber, surrounded by the work of hands like yours, minds like yours, hearts like yours. The connection across time feels almost tangible, a bridge of shared humanity that makes the millennia disappear. Back at the fire, the stories wind down as exhaustion finally claims its due. Conversations become murmurs, then whispers, then contented sighs. The fire settles into a steady glow, its crackling the only sound in the growing quiet. Sleep wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. You slept in a tight, warm pile of bodies, a fragile island of humanity in a vast, wild world. Children curl against parents, partners find each other's warmth, and the elderly claim positions closest to the fire's heat. There's comfort in the closeness, safety in numbers, and a deep, primitive peace in the knowledge that others are watching while you rest. The day's dangers are past. Tomorrow's challenges are yet to come. For now, there's only warmth and safety and the gentle sounds of your people settling into sleep around the eternal comfort of fire. What separates a drafty animal hide draped over your shoulders from actual, fitted clothing? A tiny, sharp piece of bone, or ivory, the needle. It's such a simple thing. So small you could lose it in the palm of your hand. So basic that we barely think of it as technology at all. But in the quiet laboratories of prehistoric caves, when some unknown genius first looked at a sliver of bone and imagined a hole through its center, they triggered a revolution that would literally reshape the human experience on Earth. Before the needle, clothing was more suggestion than reality. Imagine yourself wrapped in the hide of a deer, the skin roughly scraped clean, but still thick and unwieldy. You drape it over your shoulders like a primitive cape. Perhaps tie it around your waist with strips of sinew or plant fiber. It covers you, certainly, but it doesn't fit you. Every movement creates gaps where cold air rushes in. Every gust of wind threatens to tear it away. The hide is stiff, awkward, constantly shifting and sliding, requiring constant adjustment just to maintain basic modesty and minimal warmth. When you walk, it tangles between your legs. When you bend to pick something up, it falls open, exposing your back to the elements. When you sleep, it twists and bunches, leaving parts of your body uncovered and vulnerable to the night's chill. It's a constant battle between you and your clothing, a relationship of mutual frustration where the very thing meant to protect you becomes a source of daily annoyance. The winter months were particularly brutal. You might wrap multiple hides around yourself, layer upon layer, but without any way to secure them properly. You became a walking bundle of loose animal skins. Effective, perhaps, but so bulky and cumbersome that simple tasks became monumental challenges. Try starting a fire when you can barely move your arms. Try climbing or running when every step threatens to trip you on your own makeshift garments. Then came the needle, and everything changed. Picture the moment of creation. Someone sits beside a fire, turning a thin splinter of bone between their fingers. They've noticed how plant thorns can pierce leather, how sharp points can create holes. But thorns break, and they're too small, too delicate for serious work. This bone, though, this could be different. With infinite patience, they begin to hollow out one end, using the tip of a flint blade to carefully scrape and carve. It's delicate work that cannot be rushed. Too much pressure, and the bone splits. Too little, and the hole never forms. Hour after hour, they work by firelight, testing the hole with strands of sinew, enlarging it gradually until something magical happens. The sinew passes through smoothly, completely, ready to be pulled tight. Suddenly, you could do more than just cover yourself. You could tailor. The first stitches were probably clumsy, uneven, more functional than beautiful. But they held. For the first time in human history, pieces of hide could be permanently joined, shaped into forms that followed the contours of the human body. Sleeves that actually stayed on your arms. legs that moved with you instead of against you, seams that closed gaps and kept the warmth where it belonged. The sound of that first sewing session must have been mesmerizing, the soft whisper of the bone needle pushing through treated leather, the gentle resistance as the hide gave way, the almost musical tension of animal sinew being drawn tight. Each stitch created a tiny sound, a soft TCP as the needle found its mark, followed by the longer, more sustained note of thread being pulled through. It was the sound of precision, of control, of humanity imposing its will on the materials of survival. The rhythm would have been hypnotic, meditative. Push, pull, tighten, push, pull, tighten. Each motion deliberate, each stitch a small victory over the chaos of poorly fitted clothing. The person sewing would have felt the satisfaction of watching separate pieces become a whole, of seeing their vision take shape stitch by careful stitch. But the needle's impact went far beyond better fitting clothes. With this simple tool, humans could create complex, multi-layered garments that trapped air for insulation while still allowing freedom of movement. They could make waterproof seams that kept rain and snow at bay. They could construct boots that protected feet from sharp stones and frozen ground, allowing them to travel farther and faster than ever before. More importantly, the needle opened the door to truly cold climates. Those better-fitting clothes meant better survival rates in harsh winters. Suddenly, the frozen steppes of northern Asia were no longer insurmountable barriers, but pathways to new territories. The needle enabled the great migrations that would eventually populate every continent on Earth. The applications expanded rapidly. Why stop at clothing? The same stitching techniques that joined pieces of hide could create containers, bags and pouches that could be sewn shut to protect valuable items. Tents that could be erected quickly and taken down easily. Portable shelters that made nomadic life practical. Boat sails woven from plant fibers and stitched together to catch the wind. Each innovation built upon the last, but all trace back to that first moment when someone looked at a piece of bone and saw not just material, but possibility. Before the needle, you wore a costume. After the needle, you wore clothes. And that simple shift allowed humanity to conquer the cold, to travel beyond the warm climates where our species first evolved, to become the globe-spanning civilization we are today. All thanks to a tiny, sharp piece of bone with a hole through its center. Sometimes the smallest inventions create the largest changes, and sometimes the most revolutionary technology is the one we take so completely for granted that we forget it was ever invented at all. Imagine your life without containers. No cups, no bowls, no jars. How do you store water? How do you save leftover food? How do you cook soup? This was the reality for most of human existence. A world where every liquid had to be consumed immediately or lost forever, where surplus food spoiled within hours because there was simply nowhere safe to keep it. Water could only be drunk at its source, carried cupped in two hands for the brief distance between stream and mouth. Seeds and grains, those precious calories that could sustain life through lean seasons, had no protection from moisture, insects, or the countless other threats that could destroy a community's entire food supply in a single night. Picture trying to organize your life around such limitations. Every meal had to be planned around immediate consumption. Nothing could be saved, nothing preserved, nothing set aside for tomorrow's uncertainty. It was a hand-to-mouth existence in the most literal sense, where waste wasn't just inefficient, it was potentially fatal. Then, someone, somewhere, made a discovery that would fundamentally change the human relationship with food, water, and survival itself. They noticed how certain types of mud, when left to dry in the sun, hardened into shapes that held their form. It wasn't a sudden inspiration, but probably the result of countless observations, handprints left in riverside clay that became permanent after a few hot days. Or perhaps the way certain types of earth formed natural basins after heavy rains. The first attempts were crude and often disappointing. Clay shaped into bowls would crack as they dried, splitting along stress lines that no one yet understood how to prevent. Others would hold their shape perfectly until the first splash of water dissolved them back into mud. Each failure taught lessons that couldn't be found in any manual or learned from any teacher. This was pure trial and error, guided only by patient observation and the willingness to try again. Someone discovered that certain types of clay worked better than others. Some learned that gradual drying in shade prevented the stress cracks that destroyed so many early attempts. Others found that adding plant fibers or crushed shells made the clay stronger, more resilient. Each small improvement was won through tedious experimentation, through the kind of persistent tinkering that marks the difference between casual interest and genuine innovation. But the real breakthrough came by accident, as the most important discoveries often do. Perhaps a clay vessel was left too close to a fire, or maybe it fell into the coals during a moment of distraction. Instead of being destroyed, something magical happened. The clay transformed, becoming something entirely new, hard as stone but light as wood, completely waterproof, yet still porous enough to allow air circulation. The first person to pull a fired pot from the ashes must have felt like they were holding pure magic. Here was clay that had been reborn in flame, transformed into something that could hold water indefinitely, that could resist the elements, that opened up possibilities no one had dared to imagine. The revolutionary impact was immediate and far-reaching. For the first time in human history, people could store things safely. Grains and seeds could be kept in sealed jars, protected from the mice and insects that had always claimed their share of every harvest. Water could be collected during abundant times and saved for drought. The constant anxiety of immediate scarcity was replaced, for the first time, by the possibility of genuine food security. This unlocked a whole new world of nutrition. Tough grains and roots could be boiled until soft, making them edible for children and the elderly who struggled with the hard, fibrous foods that had dominated the human diet. Stews and soups appeared for the first time, allowing cooks to extract every possible nutrient from bones and tough meat, to create meals that could feed large groups efficiently and nutritiously. The cooking vessel became the center of culinary innovation. Complex flavors could be developed through slow simmering. Multiple ingredients could be combined in ways that created entirely new tastes and textures. Herbs and spices could be added to transform simple ingredients into something approaching what we might recognize as sophisticated cuisine. But pottery brought other changes too, some less grand, but equally important. The invention of the pot was also, likely, the invention of the argument over who has to wash the pot. Suddenly, there was a new chore that hadn't existed before, a new responsibility that had to be assigned within the community? Who would tend the fire under the cooking pot? Who would scrape the burnt residue from the bottom? Who would carry the heavy, water-filled vessel from stream to camp? These might seem like trivial concerns, but they represent something profound the first time human communities had to negotiate the social implications of technological advancement. Every innovation brings new complications alongside its benefits, new forms of work and responsibility that must be integrated into existing social structures. The pottery workshop became a place of quiet concentration, where skilled hands shaped wet clay with movements so practiced they seemed like meditation. The rhythmic sound of fingers working the clay, the soft splash of water used to keep the surface smooth, the gentle scraping of tools used to refine the shape, these became the sounds of progress, the audio signature of a technology that was reshaping daily life. Storage jars lined the walls of shelters, their smooth curves catching and reflecting the firelight. Cooking pots sat ready beside hearths, their dark interiors seasoned by countless meals. Water vessels waited patiently to carry their precious cargo from source to home. And at the end of each day, as communities gathered around their fires, there was often a pot sitting among the coals, its contents bubbling gently, filling the air with the rich aroma of ingredients that had been transformed by heat and time into something greater than the sum of their parts. It was more than just dinner. It was proof of humanity's growing mastery over the elements, served one warm, nourishing bowl at a time. Think about the last meal you ate. Chances are it had salt. We take it for granted. But for our ancestors, salt was the difference between life and death, wealth and poverty. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine that first taste of pure salt on your tongue. Not the refined, uniform crystals we know today, but rough, irregular chunks pulled from dried lake beds or scraped from coastal rocks where seawater had evaporated under an unforgiving sun. The initial shock is almost electric, that sharp, clean burst of flavor that makes your mouth water instantly and seems to awaken every taste bud at once. But this isn't just about flavor. That immediate physiological response you feel, the way your body seems to crave and welcome the salt, reflects something much deeper. Salt isn't just a seasoning, it's a biological necessity, as fundamental to human survival as water or air. In the blazing heat of ancient climates, where humans first learned to walk upright and think complex thoughts, salt replaced what was lost through constant perspiration. Without it, muscles cramped, thinking became sluggish, and eventually, the body simply shut down. Our ancestors understood this in their bones. Even if they couldn't articulate the science, they knew that certain white crystals found in special places could restore strength to the exhausted, could bring clarity to confused minds, could quite literally mean the difference between completing a journey and collapsing along the way. This knowledge made salt precious beyond almost any other substance on earth. But salt's true revolutionary power lay not in what it could do for the living, but in what it could do for the dead specifically. Dead animals that needed to remain edible long after they'd been killed. Before refrigeration, how do you keep meat from spoiling? You salt it. Picture the scene. A successful hunt has brought down a large animal. More meat than a small community can possibly consume in the day or two before spoilage makes it dangerous to eat. In a world without preservation, This abundance becomes a cruel paradox feast today, starve tomorrow, with most of the valuable protein lost to decay and waste. But with salt, everything changes. The preservation process is both simple and miraculous. Fresh meat is cut into strips and buried in coarse salt. The crystals drawing out moisture while creating an environment where the bacteria of spoilage simply cannot survive. Day by day, the salt works its ancient magic, transforming raw flesh into something that can last for months, even years, without losing its nutritional value. The transformation is almost alchemical. Watch as the salt draws moisture from the meat, the crystals gradually dissolving and reforming as they absorb the expelled water. The meat itself changes color, becoming darker, denser, concentrated. The texture shifts from soft and yielding to firm and leather-like. What emerges from this process is no longer just meat. It's portable nutrition, food that can travel vast distances, survive harsh weather, and feed people long after fresh food has become a memory. This preservation revolution changed everything about how humans could live and move across the landscape. For the first time, long journeys became possible without the constant anxiety of finding fresh food along the way. Ocean voyages could be attempted with confidence. Armies could march for weeks through barren territories. Nomadic peoples could follow seasonal migrations without being tethered to immediate food sources. The demand for salt grew, and with it came something unprecedented in human history: the first true international trade networks. Salt deposits were rare and geographically concentrated, creating natural monopolies that would shape the destiny of entire regions. The earliest trade routes weren't built around gold or silver or precious stones. They were built around the humble need for salt. Cities rose wherever salt could be controlled. Venice became a maritime power, largely because it controlled the salt trade in the Mediterranean. The ancient city of Salzburg, literally Salt Castle, grew wealthy from the white gold pulled from nearby mines. Entire regions organized their economies around salt production, creating some of the first examples of industrial specialization on a grand scale. The value of salt was so universally understood that it became a form of currency itself. Roman soldiers, those legendary legions who built and maintained the greatest empire the world had yet seen, were sometimes paid partially in salt rations. The word salary comes from the Latin salarium, which was the money given to Roman soldiers to buy salt. That's how valuable it was. Valuable enough that access to it became a form of payment, a guarantee of survival that was worth more than mere coin. Think about that for a moment. We use the word salary every day to describe our paychecks, our compensation for work, our means of survival in the modern world. Every time you discuss your salary, you're unconsciously acknowledging the ancient truth that salt was once so precious it served as money itself. The great salt caravans were legendary. Long trains of camels and pack animals crossing impossible deserts. Their precious cargo protected by armed guards and careful planning. Picture them moving across the endless sand, each animal carrying blocks of salt wrapped in protective coverings. The white crystals occasionally catching the desert sun and throwing back brilliant flashes of light. The sound of their movement was distinctive, the soft thud of laden feet in sand, the gentle chiming of salt blocks shifting against each other with each step, the occasional crack as dried salt split in the desert heat. At journey's end, the salt would be unwrapped and weighed with ceremonial care. Merchants would run it through their fingers, testing its purity, evaluating its quality. The finest salt was almost translucent, the crystals perfectly formed, dissolving cleanly on the tongue without any trace of bitterness or grit. This was currency made solid, wealth you could taste, power crystallized into something as fundamental as the tears we cry or the sweat of honest work. Wearing animal skins keeps you warm, but it's heavy, smelly, and doesn't breathe. The future of clothing wasn't on the backs of animals, but in the fibers of plants. Imagine the revelation that must have accompanied this discovery, that the delicate stalks growing in marshy ground could be transformed into something more comfortable than the finest hide, more durable than the thickest fur, more versatile than anything the animal kingdom could provide. It was a shift in thinking as profound as any in human history, the recognition that sometimes the strongest solutions come from the most unlikely sources. The process began with an almost impossible leap of imagination. Someone looked at the fibrous stems of flax plants, at the white bolls of cotton, at the stringy inner bark of certain trees, and saw not just plants, but potential. They saw threads waiting to be born, fabric waiting to be woven, a completely new relationship between humans and the natural world. Harvesting the raw material was only the beginning of a transformation that bordered on alchemy. Flax had to be pulled from the ground at precisely the right moment too early, and the fibers would be weak. Too late, and they would be coarse and difficult to work. The plants were then subjected to a process called retting, where they were soaked in ponds or streams for weeks, allowing bacteria to break down the woody stems and release the precious fibers within. The smell of retting flax was distinctive and not entirely pleasant, a wet, organic odor that spoke of decomposition and transformation, of something dying so that something better could be born. But underneath that earthiness was the promise of something remarkable fibers that could be spun into thread finer than any sinew, stronger than any plant material previously known. Cotton required its own elaborate ritual of preparation. The seeds had to be carefully removed from the white fibers, a tedious process that demanded patience and skill. Each cotton boll was like a small gift that had to be unwrapped with care. The fibers separated and cleaned until they formed a cloud-like mass ready for the next stage of transformation. Then came the spinning, perhaps the most meditative work in all of human industry. Using simple tools, a spindle and distaff-skilled hands learned to draw out the plant fibers and twist them into continuous thread. The motion was hypnotic, a gentle pull to extend the fibers, a quick twist to bind them together, a winding motion to collect the finished thread. Hour after hour, day after day, the spinners worked with a rhythm that became as natural as breathing. But the real magic happened at the loom, that ingenious wooden frame that would transform individual threads into something greater than the sum of its parts. The loom was humanity's first complex machine, a device that required understanding of tension, spacing, and the intricate mathematics of interlacement, back and forth, over and under, a simple, repetitive motion that thread by thread created civilization. The sound of the loom was unlike anything else in the ancient world, a gentle, rhythmic clicking as the shuttle passed between the warp threads, the soft thud as the beater pressed each new row into place, the whisper of threads sliding against each other as the fabric slowly grew. It was the sound of patience made audible, of human persistence transforming raw materials into something beautiful and useful. The weaver's hands moved with practiced precision, guiding the shuttle through the maze of vertical threads, building the fabric row by row, with movements so fluid they seemed like a form of dance. Each pass of the shuttle added another line to the growing textile, another step in the transformation of plant matter into human comfort. The impact of woven fabric on daily life was revolutionary in ways both practical and profound. Linen and cotton were dramatically lighter than leather, allowing for clothing that moved with the body rather than against it. These plant-based textiles breathed with the wearer, allowing air circulation that made hot climates more bearable and reducing the constant battle against perspiration and discomfort. Perhaps more importantly, woven fabrics could be washed effectively, something that was nearly impossible with leather garments. This breakthrough in hygiene represented a fundamental shift in how humans could maintain cleanliness and health. Dirty clothing could be soaked, scrubbed, and dried without damaging the material, opening up new possibilities for personal cleanliness and social acceptability. But fabric quickly became more than just functional clothing. The quality of weave, the fineness of thread, a piece of fine linen or intricately woven cotton communicated the wearer's position in society as clearly as any crown or jewel. Dyes extracted from rare plants and minerals transformed simple cloth into luxury goods that could display wealth, taste, and sophistication. The dyeing process created an entirely new palette of possibilities. Deep blues from indigo, rich reds from madder root, brilliant yellows from saffron. Each color required specialized knowledge and expensive materials. A person wearing fabric, dyed in multiple colors, was displaying not just wealth, but access to trade networks that spanned continents. The demand for plant fibers also drove one of humanity's most significant transitions: the shift from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. Flax and cotton required careful cultivation, regular attention, and the kind of long-term planning that was incompatible with a wandering lifestyle. Communities that wanted reliable access to textile fibers had to stay in one place, tend their crops, and invest in the future. As the last threads were beaten into place and the completed fabric was cut free from the loom, what emerged was more than just cloth. It was comfort made tangible, beauty made practical, a soft testament to human ingenuity and patience. The fabric draped naturally, responding to touch with a suppleness that leather could never match, promising warmth without weight, protection without burden. Here was civilization itself, woven thread by thread into something you could wrap around your shoulders and call home. Before writing, every story, every piece of knowledge, every law existed only in one place: the fragile memory of a human being. When that person died, a library burned to the ground. Imagine the weight of that responsibility. Picture the elderly storyteller who carried within their mind the complete genealogy of the tribe, the precise location of every water source within 100 miles, the detailed knowledge of which plants healed and which killed. Their brain was a living repository of everything their people needed to know to survive, accumulated over decades of careful observation and patient learning. But memory, for all its remarkable capacity, is desperately fragile. A fever could erase generations of accumulated wisdom. An accident could destroy irreplaceable knowledge of seasonal patterns, agricultural techniques, or diplomatic relationships with neighboring groups. Each death was not just the loss of a person, but potentially the loss of crucial information that could never be recovered. The burden on memory keepers must have been enormous. They couldn't simply remember, they had to remember perfectly because there was no backup. No way to verify information once the original source was gone. They developed elaborate techniques for preserving knowledge songs that encoded important information in memorable melodies. Stories that wrapped practical knowledge in entertaining narratives. Rituals that required the repetition of essential facts. But even the most skilled memory could only hold so much. And the growing complexity of human society was beginning to strain this ancient system to its breaking point. Communities were becoming larger, trade relationships more complex, social hierarchies more elaborate. There was simply too much information for any single mind to contain. The solution, when it finally came, was born not from grand philosophical aspirations, but from the most mundane of necessities. The first writing wasn't poetry, it was accounting. 3 goats delivered to the temple. 5 jars of beer owed. In the ancient cities of Mesopotamia, where irrigation systems supported the first large-scale urban populations, temple administrators found themselves drowning in the complexity of economic relationships. Who owed what to whom? Which fields had produced how much grain? How many workers had been paid? And how much beer did they receive as part of their compensation? Someone, driven by practical necessity rather than artistic inspiration, began to experiment with ways to record these transactions outside of human memory. They started with simple pictures scratched into clay tablets, a circle with dots inside to represent jars of grain, stick figures to represent people, lines and marks to indicate quantities and relationships. These earliest attempts were crude, but they worked. A tablet could remember perfectly what human memory might confuse or forget. It could be consulted weeks or months later, compared with other records, used to settle disputes or plan for the future. Most importantly, it could outlive the person who created it. The system evolved rapidly, driven by the relentless demands of administrative efficiency. Pictures became increasingly abstract, simplified for speed and clarity. The image of a bird gradually transformed into a few quick wedge-shaped marks that bore no visual resemblance to their original inspiration, but carried the same meaning with far less effort. The sound of this early writing was distinctive and meditative. The stylus, a wedge-shaped tool made from reed or bone, made a characteristic soft thud as it pressed into the damp clay tablet. Each cuneiform symbol required multiple deliberate impressions. The stylus held at precise angles to create the wedge shapes that gave the script its name. The rhythm was slow, purposeful, each mark carefully considered and deliberately placed. Meanwhile, along the fertile banks of the Nile, Egyptian scribes were developing their own approach to capturing human thought in permanent form. Their hieroglyphic system retained more of the pictorial quality of early writing, creating symbols of remarkable beauty and complexity. The sound of their work was different, the gentle scratch of reed pens moving across papyrus, the soft whisper of ink flowing from brush to writing surface. But regardless of the specific techniques, the impact was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, laws could be written down and applied consistently. No longer did justice depend on the memory and mood of a ruler or judge. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone for all to see, established the principle that the law itself could be permanent, unchanging, immune to the selective memory or creative interpretation of those in power. History, too, became possible in ways that had never existed before. Previous generations had relied on oral traditions that inevitably changed with each telling, facts gradually transforming into legend, real events becoming mythological over time. Written records allowed for the preservation of actual events in something approaching their original form, creating the first true historical accounts. Perhaps most importantly, knowledge could now accumulate across generations without loss. A farmer's hard-won understanding of soil conditions and crop rotation could be recorded and consulted by their grandchildren. An astronomer's observations of planetary movements could be built upon by future observers, creating a continuous tradition of scientific investigation that would eventually revolutionize human understanding of the natural world. The feel of writing itself became almost ritualistic. The scribe would prepare the clay or papyrus with careful attention, ensuring the right moisture content, the proper texture. The stylus or pen had to be held just so, pressed with exactly the right pressure to create clear, lasting marks. Each symbol required focused concentration, a mindful attention that transformed the act of writing into something approaching meditation. Writing gave us a form of immortality. Through these strange, beautiful symbols, we can hear the voices of people who lived thousands of years ago. We can read their complaints about lazy servants, their love letters, their business transactions, their prayers and fears and hopes. The clay tablets of ancient accountants speak to us across millennia. Their mundane records somehow more moving than the grandest monuments. And tonight, as you listen to these words, you are participating in that same ancient miracle, the transmission of thought across time and space, the defiance of mortality through the simple act of preserving human ideas in permanent form. We are listening, indeed, to voices that refuse to be silenced by time. We think of ancient Egypt, and we see pyramids, pharaohs, and golden masks. But for the average Egyptian building, those pyramids, life was more about sweat, sand, and the quality of their daily beer ration. The reality of ancient Egyptian life was far removed from the mystical, golden-tinged image that fills our museums and imagination. Yes, there were magnificent monuments and elaborate burial rituals, but for the thousands of ordinary people who made those wonders possible, daily existence was defined by much more practical concerns: the scorching heat of the desert sun, the gritty omnipresence of sand in everything they ate and wore, and most importantly, whether today's beer would be thick enough to fill their stomachs and keep them working. Beer wasn't a luxury in ancient Egypt. It wasn't even really what we would recognize as an alcoholic beverage. It was thick, nutritious, and probably didn't taste very good. But getting your daily ration was non-negotiable. This wasn't the crisp, refreshing drink of modern imagination. Egyptian beer was more like liquid bread, chunky with grain particles, warm from the brewing process, and often slightly sour from fermentation. It had the consistency of a thin porridge and provided essential calories and nutrients that kept workers alive in one of the world's most demanding environments. for the laborers dragging massive limestone blocks across the desert to construct monuments that would outlast civilizations. Beer was quite literally survival in a jar. The brewing process made contaminated water safe to drink, while the grain content provided carbohydrates and B vitamins essential for heavy physical labor. In a land where fresh water could carry deadly parasites and solid food was often scarce, that daily beer ration represented the difference between completing another day's work and collapsing in the sand. This dependency on beer led to what historians believe was the first recorded labor strike in human history. Picture the scene: construction workers at the Royal Necropolis, exhausted from weeks of hauling stones under the merciless sun. Gather in angry clusters as word spreads that their beer rations have been delayed. These weren't rebellious revolutionaries. They were practical people who understood that without their daily nutrition, they simply couldn't continue working. The strike wasn't about political ideology or abstract rights. It was about the fundamental compact between workers and employers: you give us what we need to survive, and we'll build your eternal monuments. When the beer stopped flowing, so did the work. The strikers didn't storm palaces or demand regime change. They simply sat down and waited, knowing that the pharaoh's grand projects couldn't proceed without their labor. The daily reality of pyramid construction was a grinding routine of almost unimaginable physical hardship. Workers began before dawn, when the desert air was still relatively cool, hauling ropes and organizing teams around massive stone blocks that had been quarried upstream and floated down the Nile. The work required perfect coordination, dozens of men pulling in unison, their movements synchronized by chanted rhythms that helped them maintain the steady pace necessary to move stones weighing several tons. As the sun climbed higher, the work became increasingly brutal. The desert wind, when it blew at all, carried fine sand that worked its way into every crevice of clothing, every pore of skin, every bite of food. Workers wrapped cloth around their faces. But the sand was persistent, creating a constant low-level misery that made every task more difficult. The limestone blocks became scorching hot to the touch, causing burns on exposed skin and making the ropes painful to grip. Accidents were frequent and often fatal. A slipping rope could crush a worker instantly. A poorly positioned lever could snap and send stones tumbling. The heat itself claimed victims: men who worked too long without adequate rest would simply collapse, their bodies unable to cope with the extreme temperatures and physical demands. There were no safety regulations, no workers' compensation, no systematic care for the injured beyond what their families and fellow workers could provide. The medical challenges went far beyond workplace injuries. The Nile River, the source of all life in Egypt, was also a source of constant health problems. The same waters that irrigated crops and provided drinking water teemed with parasites and bacteria that modern medicine would consider a public health nightmare. Schistosomiasis, caused by parasitic worms, was endemic. Workers would wade into the river to cool off or collect water, unknowingly exposing themselves to organisms that would cause chronic illness and shortened lifespans. Egyptian medical practice responded to these challenges with treatments that ranged from surprisingly effective to utterly bizarre. They understood the importance of cleanliness and developed sophisticated surgical techniques that wouldn't be matched in some parts of the world for thousands of years. But they also believed that applying crocodile dung to wounds would prevent infection. that eating mouse meat could cure bedwetting, and that placing a heated fish on the stomach would relieve digestive problems. The crocodile dung treatment, while revolting by modern standards, actually contained certain antibacterial properties that may have provided some benefit. But imagine being an injured worker, already suffering from heat exhaustion and parasitic infection, being told that your best hope for healing involved covering your wounds with the dried excrement of one of the Nile's most feared predators. In the distance, across the vast construction site, you might hear the soft sound of desert wind stirring the sand around partially completed monuments, occasionally punctuated by the rhythmic striking of chisels against stone as artisans worked on decorative details. But these sounds were almost lost in the overwhelming sensory assault of the construction site, the grunting of laboring men, the creaking of wooden levers, the scraping of stone against stone, and always the whispered prayers of workers hoping that today's beer ration would arrive on time. This was the reality behind the grandeur, thousands of ordinary people enduring extraordinary hardship, sustained by thick, warm beer, and the faint hope that their suffering was building something eternal. Rome, the eternal city, a marvel of engineering, law, and military might. It was also loud, crowded, and smelled terrible. Picture yourself standing at the edge of the Forum Romanum at midday, when the city was at its most chaotic. The grandeur is undeniable marble columns reaching toward the sky. Elaborate temples dedicated to gods whose favor built an empire. Statues of emperors who commanded legions across 3 continents. But beneath this magnificent facade lies an urban reality that would challenge even modern city dwellers. The first assault on your senses isn't visual, it's auditory. Rome was a city that never slept, never quieted, never offered its residents the luxury of silence. From before dawn until well past midnight, the streets echoed with a cacophony that made concentration nearly impossible, and peaceful rest a rare luxury. The sound began with the merchants setting up their stalls, their voices already raised in competition as they arranged their wares and began the day's long battle for customers' attention. Then came the hammering. Rome was a city in constant construction and repair, with blacksmiths, carpenters, and stonemasons starting their work as soon as there was enough light to see. The rhythmic pounding of metal on metal echoed off the tall apartment buildings, creating a percussion section that would continue throughout the day. Mixed with this was the constant scraping and grinding of construction work, the sound of chisels on stone, saws through wood, and the heavy rumbling of carts carrying building materials through streets that were never designed for such traffic. Speaking of traffic, imagine a city of nearly 1 million people with no traffic lights and streets barely wide enough for 2 carts to pass. The honking of horns was replaced by the shouting of angry merchants, but the frustration was identical to any modern rush hour. Ox-drawn carts loaded with grain from Egypt would meet wine wagons from Gaul at narrow intersections, creating gridlock that could last for hours. Pedestrians squeezed between the vehicles, dodging wheels and hooves while trying to protect their togas from the mud and worse substances that filled the unpaved streets. The problem became so severe that Julius Caesar himself was forced to intervene with what may have been history's first traffic regulation. He banned wheeled vehicles from the city center during daylight hours, hoping to ease the congestion that was literally bringing commerce to a standstill. The law was practical, but created its own problems. Now, all the heavy hauling had to happen at night, which meant that Romans trying to sleep were serenaded by the rumbling of carts, the shouting of drivers, and the crash of cargo being loaded and unloaded in the darkness. The housing situation was no better. While wealthy Romans enjoyed spacious villas with private courtyards and running water, the vast majority of the population was crammed into multi-story apartment buildings called insulae. These structures were built quickly and cheaply, often rising 5 or 6 stories high, despite having no foundations worthy of the name. They swayed in strong winds, leaked in every rain, and had an alarming tendency to collapse without warning. Your upstairs neighbor's leaking toilet was a very real, very unpleasant problem. Most insulae had no running water above the ground floor, which meant that residents of upper floors had to carry water up multiple flights of steep, narrow stairs, or rely on chamber pots that were emptied sometimes out of windows into the streets below. The smell was indescribable, a mixture of human waste, cooking odors, and the general mustiness of too many people living in too small a space with inadequate ventilation. Fire was a constant terror. The insulae were built largely of wood, heated by open flames, and lit by oil lamps that could easily be knocked over. When a fire started in one apartment, it often consumed entire city blocks before it could be controlled. The narrow streets made it difficult for firefighters to reach burning buildings, and the height of the structures put upper floors beyond the reach of the primitive firefighting equipment available. The city's entertainment venues reflected both its grandeur and its darker nature. The Colosseum, that magnificent amphitheater that still inspires awe today, was indeed a marvel of engineering and organization. But for the ordinary Roman attending the games, the experience was far from the sanitized spectacle we might imagine. The smell hit you first, a mixture of sawdust, blood, sweat, and fear that seemed to permeate the very stones of the arena. 50,000 spectators, many of whom had walked miles to attend and had limited access to washing facilities, created their own atmospheric challenge. Add to this the scent of exotic animals, the metallic smell of blood from gladiatorial combat, and the various food vendors selling everything from roasted meat to fermented fish sauce. And you had an olfactory experience that was overwhelming even by ancient standards. The games themselves served multiple purposes beyond mere entertainment. They were a form of social control, a way to keep the urban masses occupied and distracted from political grievances. Bread and circuses, panem et circenses, wasn't just a phrase. It was imperial policy. A population well fed and entertained was less likely to revolt, and the spectacles in the arena provided a sanctioned outlet for the violence and frustration that built up in Rome's crowded, difficult living conditions. But perhaps the most telling detail about daily life in Rome was how the city sounded from a distance. Travelers approaching the city from miles away could hear it long before they could see it, a low, constant rumble that rose from the valley like the sound of a distant storm. It was the voice of nearly 1 million people living, working, arguing, celebrating, and surviving in close quarters. A urban symphony that never quite found harmony, but never stopped playing. Even at night, when Caesar's traffic laws forced the heavy carts into the streets, when the shops finally closed and the hammering stopped, Rome was never truly quiet. There was always the sound of footsteps on stone, voices echoing between buildings, the distant splash of fountains, and the ever-present background hum of a great city breathing in its sleep. The Han Dynasty was a golden age of art, science, and stability. This stability was maintained by one of the most complex and, frankly, exhausting bureaucratic systems ever devised. Picture yourself in the imperial capital of Chang'an, a city that rivaled Rome in size and splendor, but operated according to principles that would make even modern bureaucrats feel overwhelmed. Every aspect of life, from the number of chickens a farmer owned to the precise wording of diplomatic letters, was subject to documentation, regulation, and official oversight. The Chinese had perfected the art of administration to a degree that was both impressive and suffocating. The path to joining this vast governmental machine was through an examination system that would make modern standardized testing look like a casual quiz. To become a government official, you had to pass a series of increasingly difficult examinations based entirely on your ability to memorize and recite the classical texts of Confucian philosophy. Imagine spending years of your life memorizing ancient texts, not for enlightenment, but for a government job. The pressure was immense. Young men would begin preparing for these examinations in childhood, spending their days reciting passages from the Analects, the Mencius, and the five classics until they could reproduce entire chapters without a single error. It wasn't enough to understand the concepts, you had to know them word for word, character for character, with perfect accuracy. The examination halls were architectural monuments to academic anxiety, rows upon rows of tiny wooden cells, each barely large enough for one person to sit with a small writing desk, stretched as far as the eye could see. During the multi-day examinations, candidates were essentially imprisoned in these cubicles, allowed only basic food and water, watched constantly by guards to prevent cheating. The atmosphere inside these halls was thick with tension and the accumulated stress of thousands of desperate young men whose entire futures hung on their performance over the next few days. The only sounds were the soft scratching of brushes on paper, the occasional cough or sigh, and the measured footsteps of proctors walking between the rows. Some candidates would collapse from exhaustion. Others would suffer what we might recognize today as nervous breakdowns, unable to remember texts they had known perfectly just days before. The questions themselves were designed to test not just memory, but the ability to apply classical wisdom to practical governmental problems. A candidate might be asked to compose an essay on how Confucian principles should guide tax collection, or to write a detailed analysis of how ancient sage kings would have handled diplomatic relations with barbarian tribes. These weren't academic exercises. They were job interviews that required demonstrating both scholarly knowledge and practical wisdom. The pressure extended far beyond the individual candidates. Entire families would invest their savings in a son's education, hiring private tutors and purchasing expensive books in the hope that success in the examinations would elevate their social status for generations. The failure rate was astronomical. Perhaps 1 in 100 candidates would achieve a position high enough to justify the years of investment. For those who did manage to join the imperial bureaucracy, life brought its own unique set of frustrations. The Chinese administrative system was thorough to the point of obsession. Every transaction, every decision, every minor administrative action had to be documented in triplicate, filed according to complex classification systems, and cross-referenced with other departments. For the local magistrate, life was an endless mountain of bamboo scrolls and paperwork. A typical day might begin with reviewing tax records from dozens of villages, each requiring careful verification and official seals. Then came reports on agricultural production, population counts, criminal cases, public works projects, religious observances, and merchant activities. Every piece of information had to be summarized, analyzed, and forwarded to the appropriate higher authorities according to precise bureaucratic protocols. The sound of government offices was distinctive, the constant soft rustling of bamboo scrolls being unrolled and rolled up again, the gentle scraping of brush pens across paper, the occasional snap of a scroll tie being secured. These were the sounds of an empire trying to manage every detail of its citizens' lives through meticulous record-keeping. Trade along the famous Silk Road added another layer of administrative complexity. Despite its romantic name, the Silk Road wasn't a single route, but a dangerous network of trade paths that required constant governmental oversight. Caravans had to obtain permits, pay taxes at multiple checkpoints, and navigate not just geographical hazards, but also shifting political alliances between the various kingdoms and tribes along the way. Merchants setting out from Chang'an knew they were embarking on journeys that could take years and might well end in death. The routes were plagued by bandits who knew exactly when and where valuable cargo would be traveling. Sandstorms could bury entire caravans, leaving no trace for rescue parties to follow. Political upheavals could suddenly make previously safe territories deadly dangerous for foreign traders. But perhaps most exhausting were the endless negotiations required at every stop. Each city-state along the routes had its own regulations, its own taxes, its own officials who had to be convinced, bribed, or placated. A merchant carrying silk to Rome might have to obtain dozens of different permits, pay tribute to local rulers, and demonstrate compliance with religious customs they barely understood. The examination system created its own peculiar culture of stress and superstition. Families would consult fortune tellers about the most auspicious dates for their sons to take the exams. Special foods were prepared to enhance memory and concentration. Candidates developed elaborate pre-exam rituals designed to calm their nerves and focus their minds. Some of the examination regulations seem almost surreal from a modern perspective. Candidates were searched thoroughly before entering the halls to prevent smuggling in written notes. They had to write with standardized brushes and ink to prevent any advantages from superior equipment. Even their clothing was regulated to ensure no information could be hidden in the fabric. The irony was that this system, designed to create the most capable and knowledgeable administrators in the world, often selected for the ability to memorize rather than to think creatively or adapt to new situations. We picture Vikings as fearsome warriors with horned helmets which they didn't wear, by the way. But they were also farmers, traders, and surprisingly, quite concerned with their appearance. The archaeological evidence tells a story that Hollywood would find disappointingly mundane. Viking burial sites are filled not just with weapons and shields, but with an impressive array of personal grooming tools, combs made from antler and bone, delicate tweezers for plucking unwanted hair, small scissors for trimming beards, and even ear spoons for cleaning out wax. These weren't the belongings of a few wealthy chieftains. They were standard equipment for ordinary Viking men and women who clearly took personal hygiene very seriously. In fact, Vikings bathed more regularly than most of their European contemporaries. While much of medieval Europe considered frequent bathing unhealthy or even sinful, Vikings made it a weekly ritual. usually on Saturdays. The Old Norse word for Saturday, lager dager, literally means washing day. They built bathhouses, heated stones to create steam, and used soap made from animal fat and ash that was remarkably effective at cutting through dirt and grease. Their hair care was particularly elaborate. Both men and women spent considerable time arranging their hair in complex styles, using imported silk ribbons and decorative pins to hold elaborate braids in place. Viking men bleached their beards with lye soap, believing that lighter hair was more attractive. They carefully maintained their mustaches and sometimes braided their beards with small metal rings or colored threads. A Viking raid might have been terrifying, but at least the raiders were relatively clean. In fact, their reputation for personal cleanliness created unexpected problems when they encountered other cultures. English chronicles complain that Viking men were too successful with local women, partly because they bathed regularly and dressed well compared to the average Anglo-Saxon farmer. The contrast was apparently significant enough to cause social tensions that went beyond the usual concerns about foreign invaders. But the most challenging aspect of Viking life wasn't combat or exploration. It was the months spent aboard their famous longships. These vessels, marvels of medieval engineering that could navigate both open seas and shallow rivers, were also floating tests of human endurance that would challenge even modern travelers. You're sharing a small, open boat with 60 other people, a lot of wet wool, and no bathroom. The longships were typically about 80 feet long and 16 feet wide, which sounds spacious until you realize that space had to accommodate not just the crew, but also their weapons, food supplies, water barrels, trade goods, and personal belongings. Each man had roughly 6 feet of length and 2.5 feet of width for his rowing station, and that space had to serve as his workplace, bedroom, dining room, and storage area for the entire voyage. The smell aboard a longship during a long voyage was indescribable. Wet wool clothing never fully dried in the salty air, developing a distinctive musty odor that mixed with the sense of unwashed bodies, stored fish, sour ale, and the various oils used to waterproof leather goods. Add to this the inevitable seasickness that affected even experienced sailors during rough weather, and you begin to understand why Viking voyages were tests of character as much as navigation skill. Sleep was nearly impossible during rough weather. The crew members took turns rowing and tried to rest on hard wooden benches, but waves constantly splashed over the low sides of the ship, soaking everything and everyone aboard. There was no privacy, no quiet, and no escape from the constant motion that left even seasoned sailors feeling queasy. Men who were legendary for their bravery in battle would spend days hanging over the side of the ship, too sick to eat or drink. The lack of sanitary facilities created problems that required creative solutions. Bathroom needs were handled by relieving oneself over the side of the ship, a process that was both undignified and dangerous in rough seas. Personal hygiene became nearly impossible to maintain, which made the Vikings' usual cleanliness standards a cruel memory during long voyages. Meanwhile, back in Scandinavia, Viking women were managing complex agricultural and domestic operations that made the famous raids possible, while their husbands and sons were away for months or even years. Women ran farms, supervised the harvest, managed livestock, and oversaw the intricate process of textile production that provided both clothing and trade goods. Viking women were skilled textile workers who produced some of the finest cloth in medieval Europe. They raised sheep, processed wool, spun thread, and operated large upright looms that could produce complex patterns and multiple colors. The sound of these looms was a constant background noise in Viking settlements, the rhythmic beating of the weft against the warp, the soft sliding of heddles, the gentle click of loom weights swaying against each other. This textile work wasn't just domestic craft, it was serious economic activity. High-quality Viking cloth was traded throughout Europe and beyond, providing much of the wealth that funded exploration and raids. The intricate tablet weaving used for belts and trim required mathematical precision and artistic skill that took years to master. Women also managed the complex process of food preservation that kept families fed through harsh northern winters. They oversaw the smoking of fish and meat, the fermentation of dairy products, and the careful storage of grains and vegetables. The survival of entire communities depended on their ability to accurately calculate food requirements and manage resources efficiently. Perhaps most remarkably, Viking women had legal rights that were extraordinary for their time. They could own property, request divorces, and represent themselves in legal proceedings. Archaeological evidence suggests they sometimes participated in trade expeditions and may have held positions of significant authority within their communities. The contrast between the popular image of Vikings as uncivilized raiders and the reality of their daily lives reveals a complex society that valued cleanliness, craftsmanship, and order. They were certainly capable of violence, but they were also meticulous farmers, skilled artisans, and surprisingly modern in their attitudes toward personal hygiene and gender roles. The Inca built a vast, highly organized empire in one of the most challenging terrains on Earth, the Andes Mountains. They had stunning cities like Machu Picchu, thousands of miles of roads, and they did it all without the wheel, writing, or money. It's one of history's most fascinating paradoxes. Here was a civilization that could move massive stone blocks with mathematical precision, create agricultural terraces that still function perfectly after 5 centuries, and organize a communication network that spanned thousands of miles of mountain terrain. Yet they never developed, or perhaps never needed, some of the technologies that other civilizations considered fundamental to complex society. The absence of the wheel wasn't an oversight. It was a practical decision based on the realities of Andean geography. In terrain where paths wound around cliff faces and climbed steep mountain passes at altitudes that left lowlanders gasping for breath, wheeled vehicles would have been useless at best and deadly at worst. Instead, the Inca perfected a different approach to transportation, an army of human runners and sure-footed llamas that could navigate terrain no cart could ever manage. The road system they built was a marvel that puts many modern highway networks to shame. Over 25,000 miles of carefully constructed paths connected every corner of the empire, from coastal deserts to high mountain passes that scraped the sky. These weren't simple dirt trails, they were engineered roadways with stone paving, drainage systems, and suspension bridges that could support heavy traffic for centuries. But traveling these roads required a special kind of endurance that few modern people could match. Imagine being a royal messenger, a chasqui, running for days on end through treacherous mountain passes, chewing coca leaves to fight fatigue. These messengers formed relay networks that could carry information from one end of the empire to the other, faster than many modern communication systems. They ran in shifts, each covering about 10 to 15 miles before passing their message to the next runner, maintaining a pace that could deliver news from Cusco to Quito, a distance of over 1,200 miles, in just 5 days. The physical demands were extraordinary. Chasqui ran at altitudes where the air contained half the oxygen available at sea level, their lungs working overtime while their legs carried them up and down mountain passes that would challenge modern mountaineers. They developed enlarged lung capacity and efficient metabolisms that allowed them to function in conditions that would disable most people. The soft thud of their sandaled feet against stone paths became the heartbeat of imperial communication. A sound that echoed through mountain valleys day and night without pause. In place of written language, the Inca developed something far more intriguing: the Quipu system. These weren't simple tools, but complex, three-dimensional information storage devices made from colored strings and an elaborate system of knots. It was a complex, three-dimensional language of knots that we are still struggling to fully understand. Archaeological findings have revealed quipus with hundreds of strings, each color-coded and positioned according to precise mathematical principles that encoded everything from population censuses to historical narratives. The Quipu masters who created and interpreted these devices were among the most important officials in the empire. They spent years learning the intricate codes that determined how different knot types, string colors, and spatial relationships conveyed specific information. A simple quipu might record the number of llamas in a particular region, but complex examples contained layered information about tax obligations, military deployments, and even epic poems that preserved important cultural stories. Watching a quipu master at work was like observing a form of three-dimensional poetry. Their fingers moved with practiced precision, tying knots in specific sequences, choosing string colors according to standardized codes, spacing elements with mathematical accuracy. The soft whisper of cotton and wool strings being manipulated was often the only sound in rooms where crucial imperial business was being conducted through this tactile form of record-keeping. The economic system they built was equally revolutionary, but in ways that would puzzle and perhaps disturb modern economists. There was no shopping. There was no currency. There was only your duty to the empire. Every citizen owed the state a certain amount of labor called mita, which could be fulfilled through military service, construction work, agricultural labor, or specialized crafts. In return, the state provided everything needed for survival: food, clothing, housing, and tools. This system eliminated poverty in the traditional sense, but it also eliminated most personal economic choices. You didn't decide what to produce based on market demand or personal interest. You produced what the state needed. You didn't save money for future purchases. The state allocated resources according to its assessment of your needs. You didn't choose your career. Your role in society was determined by your community's obligations and the empire's requirements. For many people, this created a kind of existential anxiety that had no outlet in traditional economic activity. Without markets to navigate, without money to earn and spend, without the possibility of improving your material situation through individual effort, personal fulfillment had to come from other sources: family relationships, religious observance, community recognition, and the satisfaction of contributing to collective projects that would outlast individual lifetimes. The absence of individual wealth accumulation meant that status and prestige were earned through service rather than possession. The most respected members of society were those who fulfilled their obligations most effectively, who contributed specialized skills to community projects, or who demonstrated exceptional loyalty to imperial ideals. Living in such a system required a fundamentally different relationship with uncertainty than most civilizations developed. Without savings, without private property, without the ability to accumulate resources for personal emergencies, individuals depended entirely on the continued stability and effectiveness of the imperial system. This created both security and vulnerability security in knowing that the state would provide for basic needs, but vulnerability in the knowledge that any disruption to the system could be catastrophic. The wind in the high Andes carries sounds differently than in other places. And on quiet days, you might hear the distant echo of those ancient runners, still carrying their messages across mountain passes that touch the sky. For over 2,000 years, from ancient Greece to the 1800s, doctors believed your health depended on the balance of four fluids in your body blood: phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. It's difficult for us to imagine a world where your personality was considered a medical condition, where being cheerful or melancholy wasn't just a matter of temperament, but a diagnostic symptom that required treatment. Yet this was the reality for the vast majority of human history, when medicine was based not on microscopes and laboratory tests, but on ancient theories that seemed to make perfect sense to the people who lived by them. The theory was elegantly simple, which was part of its appeal. Just as the physical world was composed of four elements: earth, air, fire, and water, the human body contained four corresponding fluids that determined both health and personality. These weren't abstract concepts, but literal substances that doctors believed they could see, measure, and manipulate. Blood was the humor of spring and air, warm and moist, like the season when life renewed itself. People with an excess of blood were sanguine, optimistic, energetic, sometimes impulsively cheerful. They had ruddy complexions, strong appetites, and a tendency toward what we might call extroversion. Too much blood, however, could make someone overly excited, prone to fever, or dangerously hyperactive. Phlegm belonged to winter and water, cold and moist like the season of stillness. Phlegmatic people were calm, reliable, perhaps a bit slow to anger or excitement. They were the steady ones, the people you could count on to remain level-headed in a crisis. But an excess of phlegm could make someone sluggish, unresponsive, or what we might recognize today as depressed. Yellow bile was the humor of summer and fire, hot and dry, like the blazing months when tempers flared and energy ran high. Choleric individuals were quick to anger, ambitious, natural leaders who made decisions rapidly and acted decisively. But too much yellow bile could make someone violent, impulsive, or consumed by rage that seemed to burn from within. Black bile corresponded to autumn and earth, cold and dry, like the season of endings and contemplation. Melancholic people were thoughtful, artistic, prone to deep reflection and philosophical insights. They were the poets and scholars, the ones who saw beauty in sadness and meaning in suffering. But an excess of black bile could plunge someone into profound depression, paranoia, or what the era called madness. The beauty of this system, from a medical perspective was that it provided clear explanations for complex human behavior and straightforward treatments for what seemed like obvious imbalances. Feeling a little down? You probably have too much black bile. The cure. Perhaps some cheerful music, a change of scenery, or a laxative. The logic was impeccable if sadness came from an excess of cold, dry black bile. Then treatment should involve things that were warm and moist. Upbeat music could lift the spirits. Travel to sunny climates could provide warmth. And purging could eliminate the excess humor from the system. Feeling feverish and energetic, too much blood. The solution was obvious bloodletting. This wasn't considered a drastic treatment, but a routine medical procedure, as common and unremarkable as taking aspirin is today. The doctor, or more likely, the barber surgeon, would make a small incision or apply leeches to release the excess. It was the universal cure for everything from a headache to the plague. The process of bloodletting had its own gentle ritual. The patient would sit quietly, while the practitioner selected the appropriate location for the procedure, often consulting charts that showed which veins corresponded to different organs and conditions. The actual bloodletting was usually quite mild, just enough to release what were thought to be dangerous excesses, not enough to weaken the patient significantly. Leeches were often preferred because they provided a more controlled form of bleeding. These small, dark creatures were kept in special containers and applied to specific points on the body where they would attach and draw blood at their own natural pace. The sensation was described as a slight pinching, followed by a gentle tugging sensation as the leash did its work. Patients often found the process oddly soothing, perhaps because they believed deeply that the treatment was helping them. The sound of a medieval medical consultation would have been surprisingly calm. There was the soft scratch of a quill pen as the doctor made notes about the patient's temperament and symptoms, the gentle clink of small instruments being arranged, and the quiet conversation as doctor and patient discussed not just physical symptoms, but personality traits, mood changes, and behavioral patterns. What's remarkable about the humoral system is how it connected physical health with mental and emotional well-being in ways that modern medicine has only recently begun to appreciate again. A humoral doctor wouldn't treat depression as a purely psychological problem or fever as merely a physical symptom. Everything was connected, part of a unified system that encompassed the whole person. The treatments themselves often worked, though not for the reasons doctors imagined. Music therapy actually can improve mood. Changes of scenery and travel can help with depression. Physical purging, while unpleasant, might have eliminated genuine toxins from the body. Even bloodletting, practiced in moderation, might have provided benefits for people with certain conditions, though the mechanism had nothing to do with balancing humors. Perhaps most importantly, the humoral system provided something that modern medicine sometimes lacks: a framework that made illness meaningful rather than random. When your mood was considered a medical symptom that could be diagnosed and treated. When your personality was seen as something that could be balanced and optimized. When your emotional life was taken as seriously as your physical health. The experience of being unwell became more than just suffering. It became a puzzle that could be solved through careful attention to the intricate connections between mind, body, and spirit. In those quiet medical chambers, where doctors listen carefully to their patients' descriptions of both physical discomfort and emotional states, where every aspect of human experience was considered relevant to healing. Perhaps they understood something about the art of medicine that we're still trying to rediscover. Imagine you need an amputation. There's no anesthesia, no painkillers. There's just a surgeon, a saw, and a few strong assistants to hold you down. This was the reality of surgical medicine for most of human history, a world where the difference between life and death often came down to how much pain a person could endure and how quickly a surgeon could work. Surgery wasn't a carefully planned procedure carried out in sterile conditions with precise instruments. It was a desperate race against time, shock, and the human body's natural limits. The preparation for surgery was both elaborate and brutally simple. Patients were given strong alcohol or opium if it was available, though these substances provided only minimal relief from what was to come. More often, they were simply given a piece of leather or wood to bite down on, something to prevent them from biting through their own tongue during the procedure. The phrase, "bite the bullet," comes from this era, when soldiers literally bit down on musket balls during battlefield amputations. The operating theater was usually the brightest room available, positioned to take advantage of natural light streaming through large windows. Surgeons needed to see clearly, and there were no electric lights to illuminate their work. The room would be prepared with basins of water, piles of cloth for bandages, and an array of sharp instruments that looked more like carpenter's tools than medical equipment. Speed was everything. The longer the surgery took, the greater the chance of the patient dying from shock, blood loss, or simply the overwhelming trauma of conscious pain. The best surgeons were legendary not for their precision or their medical knowledge, but for their incredible speed under pressure. Robert Liston, a famous 19th century surgeon, could amputate a leg in under 3 minutes. He was so fast, he once accidentally amputated his assistant's fingers as well. Liston was known as the fastest knife in the West End, and patients specifically requested him because they knew that with Liston, their agony would be over quickly. His operations were public spectacles, with medical students and other doctors gathering to watch him work with the efficiency of a master craftsman. The sound of Liston's surgeries was distinctive, the quick rasp of a saw through bone, the snap of ligatures being tied off, the efficient click of instruments being passed between surgeon and assistants. There was no time for hesitation, no opportunity for second guessing. Every movement had to be decisive and swift, but Liston's speed sometimes worked against him in unexpected ways. His most famous operation has gone down in medical history as the only surgery with a 300% mortality rate. He was performing his signature rapid leg amputation when his knife moved so quickly that it accidentally severed 2 of his assistant's fingers along with the patient's leg. Both the patient and the assistant later died of infection. But that wasn't the end of the story. A spectator watching the operation was so shocked by the speed and apparent violence of the procedure that he dropped dead of fright on the spot. It's a story that perfectly captures the strange world of pre-anesthetic surgery, a place where a surgeon's greatest skill could become his greatest liability, where trying to minimize suffering could accidentally multiply it, and where the cure could be more immediately dangerous than the disease. Yet even more deadly than the pain of surgery was what came after. Infection was the silent killer that claimed more lives than any surgical accident. The problem was that doctors of the era had no understanding of bacteria or the importance of cleanliness in preventing infection. They moved from patient to patient without washing their hands, reused instruments without sterilization, and operated in clothes that grew more stained with each procedure. The surgeon's blood-stained coat was worn as a badge of honor, a sign of experience. It was also a death sentence for many patients. These coats, stiff with the accumulated blood and bodily fluids of countless operations, were walking repositories of infection that doctors carried from case to case. The more experienced a surgeon appeared, the more stained his coat, the more dangerous he actually was to his patients. Operating rooms themselves were breeding grounds for infection. The same tables were used repeatedly without proper cleaning. Instruments were wiped off but not sterilized. Bandages were often reused after a quick rinse. Surgeons would sharpen their knives on their leather boots, unknowingly contaminating the blades with whatever they had walked through that day. The irony was profound. The very signs that indicated a surgeon's experience and success were often the mechanisms that doomed their patients to slow, agonizing deaths from infections that developed days or weeks after apparently successful operations. A patient might survive the surgery itself only to succumb to gangrene or sepsis that could have been prevented with simple hand washing. Patients understood that surgery was essentially a gamble with death. They approached it the way modern people might approach experimental treatments, as a last resort when all other options had been exhausted. The decision to undergo surgery was often accompanied by the preparation of final wills and tearful goodbyes to family members who understood they might never see their loved one alive again. The psychological preparation was as important as the physical preparation. Patients spent time in prayer, said their goodbyes, and tried to make peace with the possibility that they might not survive the next few hours. There were no guarantees, no statistics about success rates, no informed consent forms explaining the risks. There was just the stark reality that sometimes taking the chance of death was preferable to the certainty of continued suffering. In this world of medical heroism and inadvertent harm, where the bravest treatments were often the most dangerous, patients and doctors alike developed a kind of stoic courage that modern medicine has largely forgotten the ability to face uncertainty with dignity, to accept risk as an unavoidable part of healing, and to find hope even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Before the FDA, a pharmacy was a wondrous and terrifying place. The shelves were lined with colorful bottles containing everything from harmless herbs to deadly poisons, all marketed as miracle cures. Step into a 19th century pharmacy, and you're entering a world that resembles a cross between a medieval alchemist's laboratory and a modern-day health food store, with a generous dash of what would today be considered a drug dealer's warehouse. The walls are lined floor to ceiling with glass bottles in every imaginable color: amber, cobalt blue, emerald green, clear crystal, each one labeled with elegant script that promises relief from humanity's countless ailments. The air itself tells a story of pharmaceutical chaos. There's the sweet, cloying scent of laudanum, the sharp metallic tang of mercury preparations, the herbal complexity of dozens of plant extracts, and underneath it all, the faintly chemical smell of compounds that would make a modern toxicologist reach for their emergency protocols. It's an olfactory symphony of hope and danger, mixed together in proportions that no one fully understood. Behind the polished wooden counter, The pharmacist, often called an apothecary, moves with the confidence of someone who believes deeply in the healing power of his inventory. He's part chemist, part herbalist, part salesman, and part unintentional poisoner. His knowledge comes from apprenticeships, old books, and sometimes just creative marketing rather than rigorous scientific testing. The most popular remedy in any pharmacy was laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol that had become the aspirin of its age. The cure-all for everything from teething pain in babies to anxiety in adults. It was highly effective because it was highly addictive. Mothers dosed their crying infants with laudanum to help them sleep. Workers took it for back pain, and ladies of refinement used it for nervous conditions. The bottle itself was often beautiful, with an elaborate label that made no mention of the fact that users were essentially drinking liquid addiction. The effects of laudanum were immediate and profound. Pain disappeared, anxiety melted away, and the world took on a dreamy, distant quality that made troubles seem manageable. Users described a sensation of floating, of being wrapped in warm cotton, of feeling disconnected from their physical discomfort in the most pleasant way possible. It's no wonder that laudanum became so popular it actually worked, providing relief from both physical and emotional pain in ways that few other remedies could match. But the pharmacy's most dangerous section was probably the one dedicated to treating syphilis, where bottles of mercury preparations promised to cure what was then one of the most feared diseases. Mercury was administered in pills, ointments, and even vapor treatments, where patients sat in sealed chambers breathing mercury fumes. It might kill the disease, but it would also slowly poison you, causing tooth loss, nerve damage, and madness. The phrase "mad as a hatter" comes from this era, when hat makers used mercury in their work and gradually succumbed to mercury poisoning. The mercury treatments created their own distinctive symptoms. Patients' gums would turn black and recede, their teeth would loosen and fall out, and they would develop a characteristic tremor that started in the hands and gradually spread throughout the body. Their personalities would change, becoming increasingly erratic and paranoid. The cure was often worse than the disease, but doctors continued prescribing mercury because it sometimes seemed to work, at least in the short term. Even more surprising to modern eyes was the casual availability of cocaine, which was sold in eye drops, throat lozenges, and general health tonics. Coca-Cola originally contained actual cocaine, marketed as a brain tonic and intellectual beverage that could cure everything from headaches to depression. The drug was considered completely safe, a natural stimulant that could improve both physical and mental performance. Cocaine tonics were particularly popular among workers who needed to maintain energy during long shifts, students preparing for examinations, and anyone suffering from what was then called neurasthenia, a catch-all diagnosis for fatigue, depression, and general malaise. The bottles often featured cheerful advertising that showed healthy, energetic people enjoying the benefits of their daily cocaine dose. Perhaps most shocking was the routine inclusion of actual poisons in health tonics. Arsenic and strychnine were commonly used in small doses as ingredients in vitality tonics that promised to restore energy and improve overall health. The logic was that tiny amounts of these powerful substances could stimulate the body's natural healing processes, a kind of toxic homeopathy that occasionally worked, probably through placebo effect rather than any genuine therapeutic benefit. The arsenic tonics were particularly popular among people who wanted to improve their complexion, as small doses of arsenic could give the skin a translucent, porcelain-like quality that was considered highly attractive. Users didn't realize they were slowly poisoning themselves, developing a tolerance that required ever-increasing doses to maintain the desired effect. The advertising of the era was a masterpiece of creative medical claims. Patent medicines promised to cure everything from baldness to cancer, from sexual dysfunction to tuberculosis. The bottles featured elaborate testimonials from grateful customers, endorsements from fictional doctors, and claims that would make modern pharmaceutical companies face criminal charges. One popular tonic claimed to cure female weakness, male debility, consumption, dyspepsia, rheumatism, neuralgia, liver complaint, kidney disease, scrofula, catarrh, bronchitis, blood poisoning, heart disease, and nervous prostration, essentially every medical condition known at the time. The fact that such sweeping claims were taken seriously says something about both the desperation of patients and the primitive state of medical knowledge. The pharmacy window displays were works of art in themselves, featuring pyramids of colorful bottles, hanging bundles of medicinal herbs, and elaborate advertisements painted directly on the glass. Customers would stand outside, studying the promises and trying to match their symptoms with the available remedies. Today, we worry about the side effects listed in fine print. Back then, the side effect might just be the main ingredient. A headache powder might contain mercury, a sleep aid could include opium, and a health tonic might be built around arsenic. The concept of therapeutic doses versus toxic doses was poorly understood, and the line between medicine and poison was often dangerously thin. Yet there was something almost magical about these old pharmacies. Places where hope could be purchased by the bottle and where the promise of healing came wrapped in beautiful packaging and elegant prose. They were temples to human optimism, monuments to our eternal belief that somewhere, in some bottle, lay the answer to our suffering. And so, our journey through the deep past comes to a close. We've seen that for most of human history. Life was a constant negotiation with discomfort, uncertainty, and danger. From the simple, profound challenge of keeping a fire alive to the complex absurdity of balancing your four humors. We've walked alongside our ancestors as they woke in caves, worrying about the fire that meant the difference between warmth and cold, safety and vulnerability. We felt the satisfaction of the first stitches binding pieces of hide into actual clothing, witnessed the quiet revolution of pottery that allowed food to be stored safely for the first time. We've tasted the precious salt that was once valuable enough to serve as currency, and marveled at the patient hands that wove plant fibers into the first textiles. We've stood in the shadows of great empires and discovered that even the most magnificent civilizations were built by ordinary people dealing with extraordinarily ordinary problems. Egyptian workers going on strike because their beer rations were late. Roman citizens stuck in traffic jams that would make modern commuters feel perfectly at home. Chinese scholars memorizing ancient texts with the desperate intensity of students facing final exams. Vikings concerned enough about personal hygiene to pack combs and tweezers for their raids. Inca messengers running through mountain passes, carrying messages in a system so complex we still can't fully decode it. We've explored the brave and often bizarre world of historical medicine, where your mood was a diagnosis, where surgery was a race against consciousness, and where the local pharmacy sold hope and poison in equally attractive bottles. Through it all, we've seen the endless human capacity for adaptation, for finding solutions to impossible problems, for building meaning and beauty and community even in the most challenging circumstances. It's easy to romanticize the past, to imagine a simpler time when life moved more slowly and people lived closer to nature. But perhaps the greatest comfort we can take from these stories is the quiet appreciation for the present, for the warmth of a secure home, the ease of a simple meal, the miracle of modern medicine, and the profound luxury of a peaceful night's sleep. Tonight, as you settle into your bed, consider the remarkable journey that brought humanity to this moment. The countless generations who struggled and innovated and endured so that you could have the simple pleasure of clean sheets, a soft pillow, and the reasonable expectation that you'll wake up tomorrow in the same comfortable circumstances you're experiencing now. Your ancestors faced their days with courage born of necessity, finding joy and meaning despite hardships that would challenge us deeply. They built the foundation for everything you take for granted: the languages you speak, the foods you eat, the technologies that surround you, even the very concept of leisure time that allows you to listen to stories about the past. Their resilience lives in you, their innovations surround you, and their dreams of easier days have become your everyday reality. The fire in our prehistoric cave has dwindled to embers. The noise of ancient Rome has faded to a whisper. The medicines of the past are safely sealed away in the history books, and the great empires have settled into the quiet dignity of memory. There is nothing left to do now but rest in the profound comfort of the present moment. Let the stories of the past become the gentle landscape of your dreams, where you might walk through ancient markets without haggling for salt, explore Viking longships without the seasickness, or visit Roman bathhouses without the crowds and noise. Your soft bed tonight is a luxury that would have amazed our cave-dwelling ancestors. Your clean water is a miracle that would have astounded medieval villagers. Your freedom from the daily anxiety of survival is a gift that most of human history could never have imagined. As you drift toward sleep, carry with you the quiet satisfaction of understanding where you came from, the gentle appreciation for how far we've traveled together, and the peaceful recognition that every challenge has been met, every problem solved by the persistent creativity of human beings just like you. Thank you for joining me on this quiet exploration through time. Sleep well and dream peacefully